There's no disputing that the lawless expanse of the Arizona Territory fashioned its share of legendary gunslingers during the turbulent decade following the Great Railroad Wars. Men like Sidewinder, Silas Jenkins, Quickhand, Webb, the notorious Blackwell Twins, and the merciless Eclipse Donovan. But perhaps none left a more mysterious legacy than Matthew the Shadow Callahan, a man whose very name would later send tremors of dread through even the most hardened outlaws. A soft-spoken rancher turned vengeful specter, credited with dispatching 32 men to their graves, who once coldly declared, "Some men choose the path of violence as a road to glory." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I choose it only as their judgment. Join me today as we journey into the haunting tale of the man they called the Shadow, the silent sentinel of Redemption Valley, who proved that the deadliest predator isn't the one who roars the loudest, but the one who strikes when you least expect it. The town of Salvation Springs, Arizona Territory, spring of 1878. Like many frontier settlements, it consisted of little more than a dusty main street lined with weather-beaten buildings where hope and hardship danced together beneath the scorching desert sun and the looming shadow of the Superstition Mountains. It was precisely the kind of place where folks minded their own affairs, which is exactly why Matthew Callahan chose it. He arrived on a cool March morning atop a chestnut mare, leading a mule heavy with supplies, his worn duster stirring in the desert breeze. Those who witnessed his arrival would later recall two things: the well-maintained Winchester repeater strapped to his saddle, never drawn but never far from reach, and his peculiar manner of speech, soft as a whisper, forcing others to lean in close just to hear him. The way some told it, you'd think he was afraid of his own voice. Sheriff Thomas Holloway, a grizzled veteran of both the war between the states and 15 years enforcing what passed for law in the territory, observed the newcomer from the shade of his office porch, whittling a piece of cedar with a pocket knife worn smooth from years of similar contemplation. "There's two kinds of quiet men in this territory," he would later confide to his journal. "Those who've got nothing worth saying, and those who've seen too much to speak of it." Callahan had the look of the latter. Doc Wesley Miller, the town's physician and occasional undertaker, became the first to truly interact with the mysterious newcomer after Callahan appeared at his doorstep with a jagged wound across his forearm that he attributed to a disagreement with some barbed wire. The doctor couldn't help but notice what the rolled-up sleeve revealed: a constellation of old scars that told a different story than that of a simple rancher. Bullet wounds, knife marks, even what appeared to be an arrow puncture. A history, written in flesh, that no ordinary cattleman had any business carrying. But Miller was a man who had learned that discretion was often the better part of survival in the territories, and the questions he didn't ask said as much about his wisdom as they did about the respect Callahan quickly earned. Within a fortnight, Callahan had purchased the abandoned Carson homestead, 600 acres of promising grazing land nestled in a remote corner of Redemption Valley, approximately 5 miles from town. The previous owner, Abigail Carson, was a widow whose husband's brutal murder at the hands of rustlers had left her with more land than she could manage and more memories than she could bear. She had been rejecting offers for months, turning away both the Lazarus gang and various cattle barons who had attempted to pressure her into selling. There was something behind his eyes, Abigail would later tell Catherine Reynolds, who ran the general store and served as the unofficial keeper of the town's secrets. Something that told me he'd honor the land the way William would have. Something that made me feel it would be safe in his hands. What she couldn't have anticipated was just how capable those hands would prove to be, or how far their protective reach would eventually extend. The man settled into his new property with methodical efficiency. He repaired fences, rebuilt the barn that had partially collapsed during the previous winter's rare heavy snowfall, and began assembling a modest herd of cattle purchased from neighboring ranches. He paid his debts promptly, occasionally attended Sunday services, though he never joined in the hymns, and politely declined invitations to socials, barn dances, and town meetings with such quiet courtesy that few took offense. When spoken to directly, Callahan responded with either a simple nod or the briefest possible answer, his voice rarely rising above a murmur. This peculiar habit quickly earned him the moniker Whisper among the townsfolk of Salvation Springs, though never to his face. Most assumed he was simply shy or perhaps slow-witted. Only a perceptive few suspected there might be method in his quietude. Catherine Reynolds, whose general store functioned as the beating heart of local commerce and gossip, began noticing strange patterns in Callahan's shopping habits during his infrequent visits to town. He purchased ammunition with surprising regularity for a man who rarely seemed to hunt. His eyes would linger on wanted posters while he waited for his supplies to be gathered, though he never remarked on them. And despite his apparent desire for privacy, he possessed an uncanny awareness of local events and movements, often inquiring in his soft-spoken way about matters Catherine hadn't realized he would know to ask about. But it was Callahan's peculiar behavior while in town that triggered the most speculation. He never sat with his back to a door or window. His hands, though usually occupied with innocent tasks, always remained free and unencumbered. And most strikingly, no matter how sweltering the Arizona heat became, he never removed that worn duster, a garment that several of the more observant townsfolk suspected concealed more than just protection from the elements. Young Deputy Joshua "Jackrabbit" Hayes, an enthusiastic if inexperienced lawman who had earned his nickname through both his energy and his prominent front teeth, became obsessed with uncovering the newcomer's secrets. His curiosity was fueled in part by youthful boredom and in part by genuine concern for the town's safety. One morning in late April, he rode out beyond Redemption Creek, ostensibly to check on reported cattle movements, but in reality to observe Callahan's ranch from the concealment of a nearby ridge. What he witnessed that day became the subject of hushed conversation in the Broken Spur saloon for weeks afterward. "Never seen anything like it," Hayes whispered to Sheriff Holloway and a small circle of trusted regulars, his young face uncharacteristically solemn. He had 7 bottles set up along the corral fence, different distances, different heights, drew that Colt from under his duster and hit every single one, so fast I barely saw his hand move. It wasn't just the speed that chilled me, though. It was how he looked doing it, like he was just breathing. No more effort than you or I would use to swat a fly. Holloway contemplated this information with the deliberate care he applied to all matters concerning his town's welfare. He'd spent too many years in the territory to disregard such observations, but he'd also learned that a man's past was often best left buried unless it threatened the present. "Could be he's just cautious," the sheriff suggested, though his eyes revealed he believed otherwise. Plenty of folks out here practiced with a gun without meaning harm to anything but varmints and rustlers. The mystery surrounding Callahan might have persisted indefinitely if not for the arrival of U.S. Marshal Clayton Abernathy that May. The federal lawman, a legend in his own right, with 27 years of service across 5 territories, had tracked counterfeiters, murderers, and thieves through some of the most unforgiving terrain the frontier had to offer. He was passing through Salvation Springs on his way to Tucson when fate intervened in the form of a chance encounter on the town's dusty main street. Callahan had just emerged from Catherine Reynolds' store, arms laden with supplies, when he nearly collided with the marshal. Both men stopped abruptly, and those who witnessed the moment would later describe how time itself seemed to freeze. Recognition flashed across Abernathy's weathered face, his hand instinctively twitching toward his. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Holster before settling back at his side. "Well, I'll be damned," the marshal breathed, his voice carrying in the sudden stillness. "I thought you were dead." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the distant sound of approaching riders drew attention to the western edge of town. A cloud of dust marked their arrival, growing larger as it raced toward Salvation Springs. The Lazarus gang, 15 strong, and led by the infamous Jackson Lazarus himself, had arrived, their reputation for brutality preceding them like a malevolent shadow. Stories of robbed stagecoaches, raided homesteads, and merciless executions had spread throughout the territory, each tale more harrowing than the last. And with their arrival came the storm that would shatter the careful silence Matthew Callahan had built around himself. The quiet rancher watched the approaching cloud of dust, his face betraying nothing while his eyes calculated everything. Sheriff Holloway moved quickly to intercept Marshal Abernathy, pulling him into the relative privacy of the jail office. "You know Callahan?" Holloway demanded, his usual deliberate manner replaced by urgent intensity. Abernathy nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the street outside the window. "Not as Callahan," he said quietly. "Known him as Matthias Corrigan. 7 years ago, he was the deadliest manhunter the New Mexico Territory ever saw." The revelation hung in the air like gun smoke after a firefight. Holloway had heard whispers about Corrigan, a legend that had grown to near mythical proportions among lawmen. Some said he'd tracked down and eliminated an entire outlaw gang single-handedly after they murdered his family at their remote ranch near Silver City. Others claimed he could read tracks that were days old and anticipate a fugitive's movements with unnatural accuracy. All agreed on one thing: those hunted by the shadow rarely lived to see justice in a courtroom. The shadow? Holloway's voice had dropped to a near whisper, unconsciously mimicking the man they discussed. "I thought that was just campfire talk. To frighten rookies." "Wish it was," Abernathy replied, absently running a thumb along the worn grip of his revolver. "Saw his work once. Gang of rustlers up near Taos. 5 men, all taken down with surgical precision. No wasted bullets, no collateral damage. If the stories are even half true, he's put down more dangerous men than you and I combined." The lawman's conversation was interrupted by the sound of spurs jingling on the wooden boardwalk outside. Jackson Lazarus himself stood in the doorway, flanked by his younger brothers Elijah and Tobias. Unlike many outlaws who favored flamboyance, Jackson cultivated an air of refined menace. His black broadcloth coat and immaculately trimmed beard gave him the appearance of a respectable businessman, an illusion shattered only by the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. "Sheriff Holloway," Lazarus said, his cultured voice carrying the faintest trace of a Virginia accent. "How fortunate to find you in what appears to be a U.S. Marshal as well. I wanted to personally inform you that my associates and I will be conducting some business in your charming community over the next few days. I trust we won't encounter any interference." The implied threat hung in the air like the scent of rain before a desert storm. Outside, the rest of the Lazarus gang was making its presence known. 2 men had already entered the Broken Spur saloon, their rough laughter drowning out the piano player. Others were methodically tying their horses at various points along the street, establishing control of key positions with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Marshal Abernathy stepped forward, his badge catching the light streaming through the office window. "What kind of business brings the Lazarus gang to such a charming community, I wonder? Last I checked, there's still $5,000 on your head, Jackson." Lazarus smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Merely passing through. Marshall, seeking supplies, relaxation, perhaps some local investment opportunities. Nothing that should concern federal authorities. His gaze shifted back to Sheriff Holloway. Besides, I believe even lawmen understand the concept of being significantly outnumbered. At Catherine Reynolds's store, 2 of Lazarus's men were already demonstrating exactly what local investment entailed. One, a scar-faced brute known only as Hanson, swept merchandise from shelves, while his companion, a wiry man with a perpetual sneer, trapped Catherine behind her own counter. "Boss wants to discuss a business arrangement with all the local merchants," Hanson drawled, casually examining a tin of peaches before pocketing it. "Times are getting dangerous out in these parts. Folks need protection for a reasonable fee." "Of course." The bell above the door chimed softly. Matthew Callahan stood in the doorway, his presence filling the small space despite his unassuming posture. He still carried his supplies from earlier, seemingly unburdened by their weight. His eyes, usually downcast in conversation, now fixed directly on the 2 interlopers with an intensity that seemed at odds with his quiet demeanor. "Miss Reynolds doesn't need protection," he said, his voice still soft but somehow reaching every corner of the store. There was something different in his tone now, a steely undercurrent that hadn't been present before, like the whisper of a blade being drawn from its sheath. The tension in the store crystallized into something dangerous. Catherine had never heard Callahan string so many words together at once. More shocking was the subtle transformation in his bearing. Nothing obvious had changed, yet he suddenly seemed taller, more solid, the unassuming rancher replaced by something altogether more lethal. Hanson's hand drifted toward his holster, his scarred face twisting into a contemptuous sneer. "This ain't your concern, farmer. Best shuffle on out before you get yourself ventilated." Callahan didn't move. His supplies still cradled in one arm, he regarded the outlaws with the detached interest of a man studying insects. "I've heard about the Lazarus gang," he remarked conversationally, his quiet voice forcing them to listen carefully. "Ambushed that family near Fort Bowie last winter, shot the children while they slept, left the mother alive just long enough to see what you did to her husband." His eyes never left them as he spoke, and Catherine saw something in their depths that chilled her more than the outlaws' threats, a cold, calculating fury held in perfect check by iron discipline. The outlaws exchanged uneasy glances. They'd intimidated plenty of townsfolk across the territory, but something about this encounter felt dangerously different. The quiet rancher in the doorway didn't fit the pattern of frightened merchants and cowed citizens they were accustomed to. "You've got a big mouth for a dead man," the wiry outlaw hissed, his hand now resting openly on his pistol grip. "That's interesting," Callahan replied softly. "Most men don't realize they're dead until after I've killed them." The simple statement, delivered without bravado or emphasis, landed with the impact of a thunderclap. It wasn't a threat. It was a pronouncement of fact, spoken with the quiet certainty of a man who had made similar declarations before and watched them come to fruition. For a moment that stretched into eternity, no one moved. Then with a muttered curse, Hanson reached for his gun. He never cleared leather. What happened next occurred so quickly that Catherine would later struggle to describe it coherently. Callahan's supplies seemed to simply vanish from his arms. His hand moved in a blur, and suddenly a Colt revolver materialized as if conjured from thin air. 2 shots rang out, so close together they sounded almost like a single report. Hanson crumpled to the floor, clutching his shattered right shoulder. His companion fell backward against the counter, his gun hand a bloody ruin before he could even touch his weapon. Neither shot was fatal. Both were clearly aimed to incapacitate rather than kill. Callahan surveyed his handiwork with clinical detachment, his revolver disappearing beneath his duster as quickly as it had appeared. He retrieved his scattered supplies with methodical efficiency, then turned to Catherine. "You might want to bar your doors tonight, Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice once again barely above a whisper. "And keep that shotgun I know you have under the counter close at hand." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving only the gentle chiming of the bell and 2 wounded outlaws in his wake. In the sheriff's office, the sound of gunshots brought the conversation with Lazarus to an abrupt halt. The outlaw leader's face darkened as he stepped back toward the door. "It appears my men may have encountered some local resistance," he said, his cultured tone now edged with genuine menace. "How unfortunate. I had hoped we could conduct our business without unpleasantness." As Lazarus strode from the office, Marshal Abernathy moved to the window, watching the outlaw leader rejoin his brothers on the street. "It's begun," he said quietly. "God help this town." Sheriff Holloway checked his revolver with practiced hands. "God help the Lazarus gang," he corrected. "They just picked a fight with the shadow." As evening approached, storm clouds gathered over the Superstition Mountains, casting long shadows across Salvation Springs. The town held its collective breath, sensing that the quiet they had known was about to be shattered forever. And at his ranch in Redemption Valley, Matthew Callahan methodically cleaned his Colt revolver, each movement precise and practiced, a ritual performed countless times before. The soft-spoken rancher many had dismissed had shown his first glimpse of the man beneath the whispers. The shadow was emerging, and the reckoning was about to begin. Night descended upon Salvation Springs like a funeral shroud, the darkness broken only by scattered lamplight from windows where anxious residents peered out at their transformed town. The Lazarus gang had claimed the Broken Spur Saloon as their temporary headquarters, their raucous laughter and occasional gunshots shattering the usual evening quiet. Few townsfolk dared venture outdoors, the streets abandoned to the outlaws, who now patrolled like predators seeking prey. In the back room of Doc Miller's office, Sheriff Holloway, Marshal Abernathy, and the physician himself conferred in hushed tones while Miller tended to a gash on the marshal's forearm. A souvenir from a brief but violent encounter with one of Lazarus's men near the livery stable. 15 of them at last count, Holloway reported, his weathered face grim in the lamplight. All armed, most with multiple weapons. They've positioned men at the saloon, the hotel, and the livery, essential points of control. Abernathy winced as Miller applied antiseptic to his wound. Military thinking. Jackson Lazarus rode with Mosby's Rangers during the war. He's applying battlefield tactics to civic control. The marshal's eyes narrowed with grudging professional respect. The man's a butcher, but a methodical one. "What about Callahan?" Miller asked, finishing his bandaging with practiced efficiency. "I treated those 2 he shot at Reynolds's store. Clean work. Disabled them completely without killing them. That's rare skill." Before either lawman could respond, a soft knock at the rear door froze them in mid-conversation. Sheriff Holloway drew his revolver, while Abernathy positioned himself behind the door, his own weapon at the ready. Miller opened it cautiously to reveal Catherine Reynolds, her shotgun cradled in her arms. "They're searching houses now," she whispered, slipping inside. "Looking for Callahan. They've got Hanson and Turner with them, arm and hand bandaged. Lazarus is offering $500 to anyone who gives up Callahan's location." Abernathy holstered his weapon with a grunt. "Nobody in town knows where he is, I'd wager. Callahan, or Corrigan as I knew him, always was clever about his movements. Doubt he went straight back to his ranch. Too obvious." A shadow by the window shifted, causing all 4 to reach for weapons. "Good assessment, Marshal," came a familiar whisper. Matthew Callahan materialized from the darkness of the doctor's storage alcove, seeming to simply appear though he must have been there all along. "Never make straight lines when you're being hunted." Catherine suppressed a startled cry, while Miller muttered something profane under his breath. Sheriff Holloway recovered first, lowering his gun with a rueful shake of his head. "How long have you been standing there?" he demanded. "Long enough," Callahan replied, moving into the lamplight. He had exchanged his usual attire for darker clothing, the worn duster replaced by a close-fitting black coat that revealed the twin Colt revolvers now openly holstered at his hips. Without the concealing duster, his lean frame revealed the coiled strength of a mountain lion, not bulky but possessed of a lethal economy of movement. Lazarus has sentries posted at all major junctions, 2 men on the church roof with rifles, 1 at the schoolhouse. They're preparing for a siege. Marshal Abernathy studied his former colleague with undisguised curiosity. It's been a long time, Corrigan. Or do you prefer Callahan now? The ghost of a smile touched Callahan's lips. Corrigan died at Silver Springs, Marshal. Let's leave him buried. Hard to bury a legend, Abernathy countered. Especially one they called the Shadow. 32 confirmed kills over 2 years. Some still say it was closer to 50. Catherine's eyes widened, her gaze darting between the lawman and the quiet rancher she'd thought she'd known. Miller and Holloway exchanged glances, both men reassessing the soft-spoken newcomer in light of this information. "Numbers don't matter," Callahan replied, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge of steel. "Never did. Only justice mattered." "That what you call it?" Abernathy pressed. "Most manhunters bring in at least some of their targets alive." Callahan's eyes, usually downcast during his time in Salvation Springs, now fixed directly on the marshal, with an intensity that made the veteran lawman shift uncomfortably. "I gave them the same choice they gave my family. Most chose poorly." The statement hung in the air, its simple delivery somehow more chilling than any threatening boast might have been. Catherine thought of the gentle way Callahan had always spoken to her at the store, how he'd helped elderly Mrs. Watkins with her packages, the quiet thank you he offered whenever served. It seemed impossible to reconcile that man with the one standing before her now, discussing death with such casual familiarity. Sheriff Holloway cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Past is past. Right now we need to deal with the Lazarus gang before they tear this town apart. You've seen what we're up against, Callahan. What's your assessment?" If Callahan was surprised by the sheriff deferring to his judgment, he didn't show it. "Jackson's smart. He'll keep his forces concentrated, maintain control of key locations. He won't split them up if he can help it." He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "But he's got 2 weaknesses. He's overconfident, and he doesn't know what he's hunting." "What do you propose?" Abernathy asked, professional curiosity temporarily overriding his moral qualms. Callahan turned back to the group, his eyes reflecting the lamplight like a predator's in the night. "We don't fight them directly. Not yet. First, we change the battlefield, make this town work against them instead of for them." "How exactly do we do that?" Miller asked, his skepticism evident. "By becoming shadows ourselves," Callahan replied. Within the hour, Callahan's strategy began to unfold across Salvation Springs. Catherine Reynolds slipped through backyards and alleyways, delivering messages to trusted residents. Doc Miller prepared his cellar as both a safe house for vulnerable townspeople and an impromptu armory. Marshal Abernathy and Sheriff Holloway worked together to quietly evacuate families with children to the abandoned silver mine 1/2 mile. Outside town, guided by Deputy Hayes, and Matthew Callahan disappeared into the night like the ghost he was rumored to be. At the Broken Spur Saloon, Jackson Lazarus held court at the central table, a glass of confiscated Kentucky bourbon in one hand and a detailed map of the township in the other. His younger brother Elijah, a wiry man whose boyish features belied a sadistic nature, counted stacks of protection money collected from terrified merchants. Tobias, the middle Lazarus brother and the gang's enforcer, cleaned his shotgun with methodical precision, his broad shoulders hunched over the scarred wooden table. "This Callahan," Jackson mused, studying the map. "He's becoming an irritation. Let me take 5 men and burn his ranch," Tobias suggested, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Smoke him out," Jackson shook his head. "He won't be there. Men like him don't run home when they're hunted. They circle back, strike from unexpected angles. He traced a finger along the map, following the town's layout. No, we maintain control of Salvation Springs. He'll have to come to us eventually. What's so special about this hick town anyway? Elijah asked, securing money bundles with twine. Hardly seems worth the effort. Jackson smiled thinly. It's not about the town, little brother. It's about what's beneath it. He tapped the map, where the abandoned mine was marked. Our friends in Santa Fe have reliable information. The Silver Serpent mine wasn't exhausted as everyone believes. The previous owner concealed a major silver strike to avoid drawing attention. That's why we need control of this town and its surroundings. Within 6 months, we could be the wealthiest men in the territory. The saloon doors swung open, admitting a gust of cool night air, and one of their sentries, a nervous-looking man, named Cooper. Boss, something ain't right out there. Jackson looked up sharply. Explain. Lamps are going out all over town, one by one. First the church, then the schoolhouse, then the general store. It's like, Cooper swallowed hard, it's like the town's being swallowed by darkness. Don't be dramatic, Tobias scoffed. Townspeople are just going to bed. All at once. And Mackenzie ain't answering signals from the church tower neither. Jackson rose from his chair, his instincts honed by years of survival suddenly alert. Check every position now, full head count. As Cooper rushed to obey, Jackson turned to his brothers. Double the guard, something's happening. It's just one man, Elijah said dismissively. How much trouble can... The saloon's lamps extinguished, simultaneously plunging the room into near total darkness. In the confusion that followed, men reached for weapons, knocking over chairs and glasses. Someone fired a shot that splintered the bar mirror. Curses and accusations filled the air as matches were struck, providing meager pinpoints of light. Get those lamps relit, Jackson ordered, his usual composure cracking slightly, and someone find Cooper. But Cooper was already beyond finding. Outside, the streets of Salvation Springs had been transformed into a labyrinth of perfect darkness. The moon, previously bright, was now obscured by gathering storm clouds, and every street lamp had been methodically extinguished. More disturbing still, the town had fallen unnaturally silent. Not the silence of sleep, but the tense quiet of a held breath. On the church tower, where Lazarus had posted 2 riflemen, only one remained, unconscious and bound with his own belt. A note pinned to his shirt that read simply, 1. His companion had vanished entirely. At the schoolhouse, the lone sentry was discovered hanging upside down from the bell rope, gagged but unharmed. Another note reading 2 affixed to his chest. As reports filtered back to the saloon, now partially relit with the few undamaged lamps, Jackson Lazarus's face grew increasingly grim. By midnight, 5 of his men were unaccounted for, and 3 others had been found incapacitated in various locations throughout town, each bearing a numbered note. He's hunting us, Tobias growled, peering uneasily through the saloon windows at the darkness beyond, picking us off one by one. He's playing with us, Jackson corrected, his refined accent more pronounced with stress. Creating fear, division, making us see threats in every shadow. From somewhere in the darkness outside came a sound like soft laughter, quickly swallowed by the night. Several of the remaining gang members exchanged uneasy glances, hands tightening. On weapons, that's exactly what he wants, Jackson snapped, noting their reaction. To make you jumpy, scared, trigger-happy. He straightened his vest with a deliberate gesture, reclaiming his composure. We adapt, no one moves alone. Minimum 3-man teams, maintain defensive positions and light. Come morning, we'll remind this town who's in control. But morning seemed an eternity away, and the darkness outside the saloon's windows felt increasingly oppressive. The storm that had been threatening finally broke, rain lashing the boardwalks and drowning out subtler sounds, while lightning cast momentary disorienting flashes of illumination across the empty streets. Perfect conditions for him, Marshal. Abernathy observed from the shelter of the livery stable, where he and Sheriff Holloway had established a makeshift command post. Through a gap in the worn planking, they watched the saloon, where most of the Lazarus gang had consolidated their position. Rain mask sound, lightning blinds, night vision, classic shadow tactics. Holloway nodded, impressed despite his reservations. About Callahan's methods. He's already reduced their effective strength by nearly half without firing a shot, just using fear and darkness. That was always his specialty, Abernathy replied. Before he hunts with bullets, he hunts with terror. By the time he finally confronts them directly, they'll be seeing him in every corner, jumping at their own shadows. In the general store, now transformed into a relay point for Callahan's operation, Catherine Reynolds and a small group of trusted townspeople maintained communication between scattered resistance positions. The store's windows had been blacked out with blankets, and only a single oil lamp illuminated the interior, where hand-drawn maps tracked the diminishing Lazarus presence across Salvation Springs. 2 more missing from the hotel, announced Henry Foster, the blacksmith's son, slipping in through the back door. Rain dripped from his slicker as he marked the map with charcoal. Found Patterson tied up in the water trough. Note said 8. Any sign of Callahan? Catherine asked, scanning the dim faces around her. Foster shook his head. Just results. It's like he's everywhere and nowhere. A soft tapping at the rear window drew their attention. Catherine approached cautiously, pistol in hand, and pulled aside a corner of the blanket. Matthew Callahan stood in the rain, his dark clothing making him nearly invisible, except where lightning briefly illuminated his face. She quickly unbarred the door to admit him. Water streamed from Callahan's clothes, yet he moved with the same quiet precision he always had, seemingly unbothered by the elements. The others drew back slightly, regarding him with a mixture of admiration and unease. The soft-spoken rancher they had known had been replaced by something else entirely. A predator in human form, methodically dismantling his opposition with the patience of a hunter who had all the time in the world. Jackson's consolidated his remaining forces, Callahan reported, accepting a towel from Catherine with a nod of thanks. 12 men left, all in the saloon. They've barricaded the windows and posted guards at all entrances. What's your next move? Catherine asked, studying the map where more than half of the marked Lazarus positions had been crossed out. Callahan's eyes, cold and focused in a way she had never seen before, scanned the assembled townsfolk. Dawn approaches. Time to change. The game. Throughout the night, Salvation Springs had witnessed the systematic deconstruction of the Lazarus gang's control. By first light, as rain continued to fall in a steady drizzle, Jackson Lazarus and his remaining men found themselves effectively besieged in the Broken Spur saloon. Their carefully planned occupation had been reversed, transforming them from predators to prey in the space of a single night. Inside the saloon, nerves had frayed to breaking point. 2 men had tried to slip away before dawn, only to return bloody and beaten 10 minutes later, deposited on the saloon's front steps by unseen hands. Jackson Lazarus maintained his outward composure, but his tightly clenched jaw and the sweat beading his forehead betrayed his growing concern. "This is absurd," he finally declared, slamming his fist on the table. "We're 15 armed men being terrorized by one ghost from the past. At first light, we go on the offensive, burn this town to the ground if necessary, smoke this shadow out once and for all." Elijah, considerably less confident than he had been the previous evening, shifted uncomfortably. "We're down to 12 now, Jack, and those 12 aren't exactly eager to step outside." "Then we'll remind them what they should fear more," Jackson replied coldly, drawing his ornate Remington revolver. "Me!" As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the rain clouds, casting a grey pall over Salvation Springs, the doors of the Broken Spur saloon swung open. Jackson Lazarus emerged, First, flanked by his brothers and followed by the remainder of his gang. Their faces were hard with desperate resolve, weapons held ready. The street before them lay empty and still, rain puddles reflecting the overcast sky. No movement betrayed the presence of their tormentor, no shadow suggested an ambush. But as they advanced cautiously from the shelter of the saloon, something caught Jackson's eye, a solitary figure standing in the center of the muddy street, 100 yards distant. Matthew Callahan waited, his stance relaxed but alert, seemingly unconcerned by either the rain that soaked his clothing or the armed men approaching. His hands rested loosely at his sides, nowhere near the twin Colts holstered at his hips. Behind him, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, silhouetting him against the dawn. "That's close enough," he called, his voice carrying clearly despite its soft tone. Jackson Lazarus raised a hand, halting his men's advance. For a long moment, the two leaders assessed each other across the rain-swept distance. Then Jackson stepped forward, separating himself slightly from his group. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience, Mr. Callahan," he said, forced joviality, barely masking his rage. "Or should I call you the Shadow? Your reputation precedes you." "As does yours," Callahan replied evenly. 13 women and children at the Fort Bowie settlement. 8 travelers on the Santa Fe Trail. The Carson family here in Redemption Valley. Your ledger runs deep with innocent blood, Lazarus. Jackson's smile hardened. "Business necessities. Nothing personal." "It's personal to me. Because of your family at Silver Springs." Jackson's smile widened as surprise flickered briefly across Callahan's impassive features. "Oh yes, I know who you are. Did you think you were the only one hunting? I've made a study of you, Shadow, ever since you started dismantling the Blackwell operation last year. I know how your wife and daughter died. I know what you did to the men responsible." Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating Callahan's face, not with the fury Jackson had hoped to provoke, but with a cold, analytical calm that was somehow more unnerving. "Then you know how this ends," Callahan said quietly. Jackson laughed, the sound brittle with strain. "Hardly. You see, I have something the others didn't." He gestured expansively at his remaining men. "Numbers, planning, and most importantly, I don't fear the dark or its shadows." "You should," Callahan replied, then so softly that Jackson had to strain to hear, "You will." From the rooftops and windows surrounding the street, rifle barrels emerged. Marshal Abernathy, Sheriff Holloway, and Deputy Hayes stepped from concealment. On the boardwalk to Callahan's right, Catherine Reynolds and several armed townspeople appeared to his left. Within moments, the remaining members of the Lazarus gang found themselves caught in the open, surrounded on all sides. Jackson's confident expression faltered as he realized the trap they had walked into. His men shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of how exposed they stood in the center of the muddy street. But as quickly as it had slipped, Jackson's composure returned. His smile twisted into something cruel as he gestured to Tobias, who stepped forward dragging a struggling figure. Dr. Miller stumbled into view, a knife pressed against his throat, his medical bag still clutched in one hand as if he'd been captured. While responding to an emergency, insurance policy, Jackson called out cheerfully. Found this one slipping between houses during the night, thought he might come in handy. He nodded to Tobias, who pressed the blade more firmly against the doctor's neck, drawing a thin line of blood. "Now, shall we discuss terms for our peaceful departure from your charming community?" The tableau held for a long moment. Callahan, standing alone while Lazarus used Miller as a human shield, each man's followers tensed and ready. The rain continued to fall, drumming on boardwalks and rooftops, washing away footprints and blood alike. "Let him go," Callahan said finally, his quiet voice somehow carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your quarrel is with me now. Jackson's smile widened. Indeed it is. So here's my proposition. You for the doctor. You come with us, he stays. We ride out, everyone lives. Refuse, he dies first. Then we see how many of your townsfolk we can take with us. A murmur of concern rippled through the gathered resistance. Marshal Abernathy caught Holloway's eye, a silent question passing between them. Holloway gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. They had no clean shot with Miller in the way. "Tick-tock, Shadow," Jackson called, visibly relishing his restored advantage. "What's it to be, one life or many? That's always been your dilemma, hasn't it? How many innocents is your vengeance worth?" Callahan stood motionless in the thinning rain, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his gun belt, letting the holstered Colts fall to the mud at his feet. "Just me," he said quietly. "No one else." "No." Catherine's voice rang out, her shotgun still aimed at the Lazarus gang. "You can't trust them." Callahan didn't turn, his eyes fixed on Jackson. "Lazarus. It's not about trust, Miss Reynolds. It's about calculation." He began walking forward, hands raised slightly from his sides, moving with the same calm precision that characterized everything he did. Behind him, Holloway and Abernathy exchanged grim glances, weapons still trained on the outlaws, but options severely limited. As Callahan reached the halfway point between the two groups, Jackson Lazarus's smile became a grin of triumph. "Wise choice, Shadow. But after all the trouble you've caused, I've reconsidered my generous offer." He nodded to his brothers. "Take him, then we'll deal with the rest of this town." What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. As Elijah and another gang member moved to seize Callahan, the soft-spoken rancher's demeanor changed in an instant. His previously relaxed posture transformed into coiled deadliness, and from beneath his rain-soaked coat appeared a small derringer that had escaped notice during his apparent surrender. Two shots cracked across the muddy street, so close together. They sounded almost as one. Elijah Lazarus collapsed with a bullet in his knee, while his companion dropped his weapon, clutching a shattered wrist. Simultaneously, Dr. Miller drove his elbow backward into Tobias's midsection with surprising strength for a man of his profession, ducking away from the knife at his throat. The moment Miller cleared the line of fire, a rifle shot rang out from the hotel balcony, Marshal Abernathy's hunting rifle, precisely placed. Tobias Lazarus fell backward, the knife tumbling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Chaos erupted in the street as both sides opened fire. Callahan moved with preternatural speed, diving for cover behind a water trough as bullets churned the mud where he had stood moments before. Jackson Lazarus bellowed orders, trying to rally his disintegrating forces while retreating toward the dubious shelter of an overturned wagon. The gunfight was brief but intense. The crack of revolvers and repeating rifles echoing between the rain-slicked buildings of Salvation Springs. When silence finally fell, 3 more of Lazarus's men lay dead in the street, another 2 wounded and surrendering. The remainder, including Elijah Lazarus, had been captured while attempting to flee, but of Jackson Lazarus and Matthew Callahan, there was no sign. Both had vanished in the confusion of the firefight, leaving nothing but footprints in the mud that led in opposite directions. One set toward the livery stable, the other toward the edge of town. The final confrontation between Shadow and Outlaw had merely been postponed, and as the citizens of Salvation Springs emerged cautiously from cover to assess the damage, all knew with grim certainty that the bloodiest chapter of this story was yet to be written. By midday, the storm had passed, leaving Salvation Springs drenched but cleansed. The bodies of fallen outlaws had been removed from the muddy street, the wounded tended in Doc Miller's surgery, and 6 captured members of the Lazarus gang secured in the town jail under Deputy Hayes's watchful eye. The residents emerged from hiding places and defensive positions, cautiously reclaiming their town, while casting wary glances toward the surrounding countryside, where both Callahan and Jackson Lazarus had vanished. Sheriff Holloway established a command post in the telegraph office, coordinating search parties and sending urgent messages to neighboring settlements. Marshal Abernathy pored over maps of the region, his expression grim as he traced possible escape routes with a weathered finger. "He'll head for the high country," Abernathy muttered, tapping the jagged line representing the Superstition Mountains. "Plenty of hiding places, multiple routes to the border." "Callahan or Lazarus?" Holloway asked, joining him at the map. "Both. Predator and prey. The hunt's gone personal now." Catherine Reynolds entered, carrying a tray of coffee. The general, store owner, had transformed during the crisis, her usual measured demeanor replaced by decisive practicality. "Elijah Lazarus is conscious again, says he wants to talk, probably hoping to bargain," Abernathy replied, accepting a steaming cup with a nod of thanks. "His kind always does when cornered." In the jailhouse, Elijah Lazarus sat in the corner cell, his wounded leg bandaged but untreated with painkillers. The youngest Lazarus brother had lost his earlier bravado, his boyish features pinched with pain and fear. When Abernathy and Holloway entered, he gripped the cell bars with white-knuckled hands. "You have to call him off," he blurted without preamble. "Corrigan, the Shadow, whatever he calls himself now. Jack's heading for the old mining camp in Black Mesa Canyon, and Corrigan's tracking him. If he catches Jack alone—" He shuddered visibly. "You're lawmen. You're supposed to bring men to justice, not let them be hunted down." Abernathy's expression remained impassive. "Considered that before your gang terrorized this town. Besides, what makes you think we could stop Callahan even if we wanted to?" Elijah slumped against the bars. "You don't understand. Jack knows things about Corrigan. About what really happened at Silver Springs. About his family. This caught Holloway's attention." "What things?" "Jack wasn't just running from the Shadow these past years. He was studying him, following his trail, collecting information." Elijah winced as he shifted his wounded leg. "Silver Springs wasn't just random violence. Jack says Corrigan's family was targeted specifically. There was a reason." Holloway and Abernathy exchanged troubled glances. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. If the massacre that created the Shadow hadn't been random banditry but something more deliberate, then Callahan's years of vengeance took on an entirely different dimension. "Why would your brother research a man who wanted to kill him?" Holloway demanded, skepticism evident. "Knowledge is power," Elijah replied, echoing his older brother's favored phrase. "Jack always said if you understand what drives a man, you control him. And he found something in Corrigan's past, something from before Silver Springs, something that changes everything." As the lawman questioned Elijah further, a solitary rider crested a ridge overlooking Black Mesa Canyon, 5 miles from Salvation Springs. Matthew Callahan dismounted, studying the rugged terrain through a brass spyglass. Below, nestled among wind-carved rock formations, the abandoned mining camp sprawled like a skeletal hand, collapsing structures and rusting equipment casting long afternoon shadows across the canyon floor. Movement caught his eye, a lone figure weaving between buildings, clearly searching for something with methodical precision. Jackson Lazarus had reached the camp first, but his purpose remained unclear. Callahan returned the spyglass to his saddlebag and retrieved a wooden box secured with leather straps. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, lay instruments of his former trade. "These is specialized ammunition, a disassembled rifle of unusual design, tools for both tracking and killing." For the first time since arriving in Salvation Springs, Callahan permitted himself to fully embrace the identity he had attempted to leave behind. The quiet rancher receded like morning mist, replaced by the manhunter who had become legend. His movements became even more economical, his awareness sharpening to predatory focus. The transformation was subtle but profound, less a change in behavior than the removal of a carefully constructed mask. He secured his horse in a sheltered ravine and began his approach on foot, moving like a shadow across terrain that would have challenged less experienced men. The abandoned mining camp grew larger as he descended, using natural features for concealment. Jackson Lazarus remained visible through gaps in the dilapidated structures, seemingly unaware of the hunter closing distance with each passing minute. Meanwhile, at the Silver Serpent mine outside Salvation Springs, Catherine Reynolds made a disturbing discovery. While helping evacuated families retrieve belongings they'd left during their hasty relocation to the mine, she noticed peculiar markings scratched into support beams, recent markings, not old miners' notations. Following the trail of symbols led her deeper into the abandoned workings, where fresh bootprints marred the dusty floor. "Someone's been mapping the mine," she reported to Abernathy and Holloway after returning to town. "Recently, and there's a side tunnel that's been partially cleared. Looks like someone was searching for something specific." Abernathy's expression darkened. "The hidden silver strike Elijah mentioned. But there's something else," Catherine continued, unfolding a crumpled piece of paper she'd found discarded in the mine. "I found this in what looks like a makeshift camp." The paper contained a crude map of Salvation Springs, with the Carson Ranch, now Callahan's property, prominently circled. Scrawled annotations detailed underground features extending from the Silver Serpent mine toward the ranch property, with one notation particularly chilling. "Primary vein runs directly beneath Corrigan, Callahan property. Eliminate occupant. Full mineral rights revert to county for claim." This was never about the town, Holloway realized. It was about Callahan's land all along. But why target him specifically, Catherine wondered. They couldn't have known who he really was when he first arrived. Abernathy's weathered face revealed dawning comprehension. Unless they did. Unless Callahan wasn't just hiding here, he was waiting. Back at Black Mesa Canyon, the sun hung low over the western horizon, casting the abandoned mining camp in deepening shadows. Jackson Lazarus had finally located what he sought. A weather-beaten cabin, half hidden behind a collapsed ore processing shed. He forced the warp door open and disappeared inside, emerging moments later with a small metal strongbox. From his vantage point among tumbled boulders 50 yards away, Callahan observed this development with cold interest. He had closed the distance methodically, positioning himself for a clear line of sight to multiple potential escape routes. The rifle he'd assembled now rested comfortably against his shoulder, its specialized scope focused on his quarry. Lazarus set the strongbox on a flat rock and produced a key from inside his coat. As the lid creaked open, his expression transformed from tense concentration to triumphant satisfaction. He removed several folded documents, examining them in the fading light with the care of a scholar reviewing ancient texts. "I know you're there, Shadow," he called suddenly, not looking up from the papers. "You move well, but no man entirely escapes making sound." Callahan remained motionless, the rifle's scope revealing every detail of Lazarus's face, the smug curl of his lip, the calculating gleam in his eye. He could end it with a single shot, as he had so many times before, yet something in Lazarus's confidence gave him pause. "These make for fascinating reading," Lazarus continued, waving the documents. "Military records, court transcripts, the true history of Lieutenant Matthew Corrigan, disgraced Army scout and convicted traitor." He looked up then, scanning the surrounding terrain. "Did your wife know what you'd done before you changed your name? Before you buried your past and tried to become something else?" The words struck like physical blows, though Callahan's exterior remained impassive. His finger hovered near the trigger, muscle memory and years of vengeful purpose demanding completion. Yet the questions Lazarus raised had haunted him for years, questions he had outrun but never escaped. "The families of the men you've hunted deserve justice too," Lazarus called. "Everyone sees you as the righteous avenger, but I know what drove you to Silver Springs in the first place, what you were running from, who you were hiding from." Callahan's scope revealed the documents more clearly now, military seals visible. On yellowed paper, signatures and stamps he had hoped never to see again. Papers he believed had been destroyed in a courthouse fire years before his family's murder. "Your reckoning isn't just about what happened at Silver Springs," Lazarus continued, his voice carrying in the canyon's perfect acoustics. "It's about what happened before, about the men who died under your command in the Apache campaign, about the testimony you gave that sent 3 officers to prison, about the price that was placed on your head long before you became the Shadow." Into the gathering darkness of Black Mesa Canyon, the hunter found his certainty wavering for the first time in years. The simple narrative of vengeance that had propelled him through countless pursuits suddenly seemed incomplete, the clean lines of justice and retribution blurred by long-buried complications. And as night claimed the abandoned mining camp, 2 predators circled each other in the darkness, each possessing pieces of a truth more complex than either had fully acknowledged. The Shadow's reckoning had taken an unexpected turn, forcing him to confront not just an enemy, but the specter of his own buried past. "You're lying." The words emerged from the darkness, quiet yet distinct, as Matthew Callahan finally broke his silence. He shifted position, moving with liquid precision to a new vantage point among the tumbled rocks overlooking the mining camp. Typical Lazarus manipulation. Jackson Lazarus smiled, seemingly unperturbed by the disembodied voice. "Am I? Then why haven't you pulled that trigger yet?" He carefully refolded the documents, returning them to the strongbox with deliberate movements. "You've never hesitated before. 16 men in New Mexico, 9 in Colorado, 7 here in Arizona, all dispatched with the cold efficiency that made you a legend." The night had fully claimed Black Mesa Canyon now, the abandoned mining camp illuminated only by a sliver of moon and the small lantern Lazarus had lit beside the strongbox. Shadows danced across weathered buildings and rusted equipment, transforming the ghost town into a labyrinth of darkness and fleeting light. "The massacre at Silver Springs wasn't random," Lazarus continued, moving away from the strongbox toward the shelter of a collapsed ore chute. "Your family wasn't killed by ordinary bandits. They were executed by men following orders, men working for the same military authorities you betrayed. Your wife and daughter died because of your testimony against Colonel Hargrove and his officers." A heavy silence followed this pronouncement, broken only by the distant cry of a hunting owl. When Callahan finally spoke again, his voice came from an entirely different direction, the words edged with dangerous restraint. "You've done your research, Lazarus, but you've misunderstood the situation." The soft voice seemed to float through the night air, impossible to pinpoint. "Hargrove was executing peaceful Apache families and blaming the deaths on hostile bands to justify expanding the war. I testified because 17 children died in a camp under my protection. Their only crime was being born Apache." Lazarus moved again, seeking better cover as he strained to locate his pursuer in the darkness. "Noble sentiments from the Shadow, but the military records tell a different story. They claim you were selling information to both sides, that the Apache camp was an ambush arranged by you. That's why you fled after the court-martial, not out of principle, but to escape a hanging." The crack of a rifle shot shattered the night stillness, the bullet striking inches from Lazarus's boot. Not a miss, a warning. The military records were falsified. Callahan replied, his whisper somehow more menacing than a shout could ever be. Hargrove had friends in high places. They buried the truth along with those Apache families. In Salvation Springs, an unexpected arrival threw the town's recovery efforts into disarray. 3 riders approached from the north, moving with the practiced coordination of men accustomed to dangerous territory. Marshal Abernathy, positioned on the church roof with a spyglass, recognized the lead rider immediately. "Colonel Edward Hargrove," he announced to Sheriff Holloway as they convened on the boardwalk outside the jail. "Retired from the army 5 years ago after a controversial court-martial reduced his rank. Now works as chief of security for Western Mining Consolidated." "The same Hargrove that Elijah Lazarus mentioned?" Holloway asked, instinctively checking his revolver. "The very same. And if he's here, this situation just got considerably more complicated." Colonel Hargrove cut an imposing figure despite his years. A tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-grey hair and the rigid posture of a lifetime soldier. His companions were clearly hired guns, their worn dusters and vigilant eyes marking them as experienced manhunters. As they dismounted before the sheriff's office, Hargrove surveyed the town with the critical assessment of a man accustomed to command. "Marshal Abernathy," he acknowledged coldly, "I wasn't aware federal authorities had jurisdiction in this backwater." "Special circumstances," Abernathy replied, matching the colonel's frosty tone. "What brings the distinguished Colonel Hargrove to Salvation Springs?" Hargrove's smile never reached his eyes. "A dangerous fugitive. I believe you've been calling him Matthew Callahan. His real name is Matthew Corrigan, former Army scout and wanted deserter. My employers have a substantial interest in seeing him apprehended." "Your employers being Western Mining Consolidated?" Holloway interjected, studying the colonel with undisguised suspicion. "Precisely. We recently acquired mineral rights to several properties in this region, including the Silver Serpent mine. Mr. Corrigan has interfered with company operations previously. We have reason to believe he's doing so again." Hargrove produced an official-looking document from inside his coat. "This is a federal warrant for Corrigan's arrest on charges of desertion, perjury, and treason." Catherine Reynolds, who had been listening from the doorway of the telegraph office, stepped forward with uncharacteristic boldness. "That's quite a coincidence, Colonel. Western Mining acquiring interests in a supposedly exhausted silver mine, just as we discover there's a hidden strike running beneath Callahan's property." Hargrove's gaze sharpened as he assessed Catherine with new interest. "I don't believe we've been introduced, Miss Reynolds. I own the general store, and I'm curious how your company knew about silver deposits that even the original mine owners believed were depleted." The tension on the boardwalk thickened as Hargrove and his men exchanged glances. Marshal Abernathy shifted subtly, positioning himself between Catherine and the newcomers, his hand resting near his holster. "Corporate prospecting is proprietary information," Hargrove replied smoothly, "but I assure you everything is being conducted legally." His attention returned to the lawman. "Now I'll ask again, where is Corrigan?" Back at Black Mesa Canyon, the deadly game of cat and mouse continued as Callahan and Lazarus circled each other in the moonlit ruins. Lazarus had taken refuge in the old assay office, a stone structure more intact than most buildings in the abandoned camp. Callahan moved like a ghost through the shadows, always visible enough to keep Lazarus on edge, never exposed enough to present a clear target. "You still haven't explained your interest in my past," Callahan called softly from somewhere in the darkness. "Why would an outlaw like Jackson Lazarus care about a disgraced army scout?" Lazarus barked a harsh laugh. "Because we're more alike than you think, Shadow. We both understand that power comes from knowledge. Information is more valuable than gold in the right circumstances." He peered cautiously through a broken window, his Remington ready. "Besides, my involvement with Silver Springs wasn't coincidental. I was hired This revelation landed like a physical blow. Callahan went completely still, even his breathing suspended as the implications crystallized. "A Hargrove sent you," he stated finally, the words barely audible. Not directly, there were intermediaries, but the orders originated with him. Kill the family, make it look like random violence. Simple job. Lazarus shifted positions again, moving deeper into the assay office. "What no one expected was for you to survive, or to become the shadow. Why tell me this now?" Callahan's voice had taken on a new quality, something raw beneath the customary quiet. "Because Hargrove never stops hunting his enemies, because he's probably already in Salvation Springs, and because I'd rather see you kill him than allow him to complete his plan." The pieces were falling into place now. Lazarus's interest in the region, the attention to Callahan's property, the elaborate scheme to control Salvation Springs. Not just a criminal enterprise, but a coordinated strategy with deeper purposes. The silver vein, Callahan realized aloud. That's what this is truly about. Hargrove found out about the hidden strike that runs beneath my land. Western Mining. Consolidated, Lazarus confirmed. Hargrove's new employers. They've been quietly acquiring properties throughout the territory. The silver deposit beneath Redemption Valley is potentially one of the richest strikes in a decade, worth millions. In this sudden, decisive movement, Callahan emerged from cover, stepping into the moonlight, where Lazarus could clearly see him. His rifle was lowered, though still ready. For a moment, hunter and hunted regarded each other directly for the first time since their confrontation in Salvation Springs. "We have a common enemy," Callahan said quietly. Lazarus studied him with wary calculation. "Temporarily. Sufficient for now." The uneasy alliance forged in the ruins of Black Mesa Canyon would have shocked the residents of Salvation Springs had they witnessed it. Two predators, momentarily setting aside their mutual hatred to confront a greater threat. By dawn, they were riding toward town, determination evident in every line of their bodies. As morning light spilled across Salvation Springs, Colonel Hargrove implemented his next move. His men positioned themselves strategically throughout town while he established headquarters in the Broken Spur Saloon, requisitioning the same table Jackson Lazarus had occupied days earlier. Maps and documents covered the scarred wood surface as Hargrove outlined his strategy to a nervously attentive audience of town leaders. "Corrigan is not merely a fugitive, but a dangerous subversive," Hargrove explained, his military bearing lending authority to his words. During his time as an Army scout, he made contact with radical elements among the Apache. His testimony against honorable officers was part of a larger plot to undermine military operations in the territory. Sheriff Holloway maintained a skeptical expression. "That contradicts what Marshal Abernathy has told me about the case." Hargrove's smile was coldly dismissive. Marshal Abernathy was not privy to classified information. The full extent of Corrigan's treachery was known only to senior military authorities. He unfolded an official-looking document bearing Army seals. This details the actual findings of the court-martial. Corrigan was found guilty of providing intelligence to hostile Apache bands, resulting in the deaths of 9 soldiers. Doc Miller, present as a town representative, leaned forward with interest. "Yet you're saying he's now the Shadow, a man known for hunting down outlaws and criminals. That seems inconsistent with your characterization." "Classic misdirection," Hargrove replied smoothly. "By targeting known criminals, Corrigan creates a heroic persona that shields him from his true crimes. Meanwhile, he continues to operate against government interests in this region." Catherine Reynolds, watching from near the saloon entrance, noted the careful construction of Hargrove's narrative. Plausible enough to create doubt, detailed enough to seem authoritative. More concerning were the reactions of some townspeople, whose expressions revealed growing uncertainty about the mysterious rancher who had defended their community. "What exactly is your interest in apprehending Callahan?" she asked directly, stepping forward. "Is it justice for these alleged crimes, or Western Mining's interest in his land?" Hargrove's eyes narrowed at the challenge. "Young woman, you're venturing into matters beyond your comprehension. My company's business interests and this military matter are entirely separate issues." "Are they?" Marshal Abernathy entered the saloon, his badge catching the morning light. "Because I've just received a telegram from the Federal Marshal's office in Denver. There's no current warrant for Matthew Corrigan. Whatever documents you're presenting are forgeries." The atmosphere in the saloon instantly transformed, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. Hargrove's hired guns shifted positions, hands drifting toward weapons. The colonel himself remained outwardly composed, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "You're exceeding your authority, Marshal," he stated coldly. "This is a military matter, not civilian." "Except you're no longer military," Abernathy countered. "You're a private citizen working for a mining company, and you're attempting to use false credentials to intimidate a peaceful community." Hargrove's facade of reasonableness cracked, revealing the steel beneath. "I've spent 15 years hunting traitors like Corrigan. I won't be stopped by backwater legalities or an overreaching federal marshal." He signaled to his men. "Secure the town. No one enters or leaves until Corrigan is located." Outside the saloon, the morning quiet shattered as Hargrove's men implemented their takeover. Unlike the Lazarus gang's brute force approach, these were disciplined professionals executing a carefully planned operation. Within minutes, they had established checkpoints at key intersections, positioned snipers on the church steeple and hotel roof, and begun systematic searches of prominent buildings. Sheriff Holloway found himself effectively imprisoned in his own jail office, his deputy locked in a cell alongside the remaining Lazarus gang members. Marshal Abernathy was detained in the saloon, disarmed but treated with grudging professional courtesy. Catherine Reynolds and other potential resistance leaders were gathered in the schoolhouse under armed guard. By midday, Salvation Springs had fallen under a different kind of occupation, more orderly but equally oppressive. Hargrove established himself in the sheriff's office, converting it to a command center from which he coordinated search parties and interrogations. His primary focus remained locating Callahan, but he took equal interest in the documents Catherine had discovered relating to the silver deposits. "Everything proceeding according to schedule, Colonel," reported Morgan, Hargrove's second-in-command. "We've secured the town. Survey teams are preparing to examine the Silver Serpent mine workings." Hargrove nodded approvingly. "And the perimeter?" "Established. As ordered. If Corrigan approaches from any direction, we'll know." What neither realized was that their quarry was already within their carefully established perimeter, having entered Salvation Springs before dawn through the network of old mining tunnels that Catherine had discovered days earlier. Beneath the town, in the shadowy confines of abandoned workings, Matthew Callahan and Jackson Lazarus prepared for a counterattack that would forever change the peaceful community above. And as afternoon shadows lengthened across Salvation Springs, the stage was set for a confrontation that would finally bring all secrets to light, the culmination of a vendetta spanning years and territories, a reckoning long delayed, but now unavoidable. Beneath Salvation Springs, the labyrinthine network of abandoned mining tunnels had become an unexpected sanctuary. Oil lamps cast wavering shadows across rough-hewn walls as Matthew Callahan bent over a crude map sketched in the dirt floor. Across from him, Jackson Lazarus examined the loading mechanism of a borrowed shotgun, his aristocratic features incongruous. In the subterranean gloom, "Hargrove has 20 men," Callahan observed quietly, indicating positions on the map. "All former military or experienced hired guns. They've established a defensive perimeter with overlapping fields of fire. Methodical. Professional. Unlike my operation," Lazarus remarked with grudging admiration. "I see why he hired me rather than handling it himself. Plausible deniability. Their unlikely alliance remained fragile, built on mutual necessity rather than trust. Each man kept a careful distance from the other, weapons always within reach, eyes watchful even as they collaborated. "Why did you keep these?" Callahan asked suddenly, nodding toward the strongbox containing the military documents. "You could have used them against me years ago." Lazarus paused in his examination of the shotgun. "Information is power, Shadow. I collect it instinctively. Besides, I recognize their value. The man who controls your past controls your actions. Yet here we are, temporarily aligned. Necessity makes strange bedfellows." Lazarus replied with a thin smile. "Don't mistake this for redemption. Once Hargrove is eliminated, we return to our original arrangement." Callahan nodded, accepting this with the same quiet fatalism that characterized all his actions. "Assuming either of us survives..." Their planning session was interrupted by the scrape of boots against stone as Catherine Reynolds emerged from a side tunnel, accompanied by Marshal Abernathy and 3 townsmen. The marshal's eyebrows rose at the sight of Lazarus, his hand instinctively moving toward the empty holster at his hip. "Easy, Marshal," Catherine cautioned. "Uncomfortable as it is, we need every ally available." "You escaped Hargrove's detention," Callahan noted, straightening from the map. Catherine's smile held grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Watkins's sewing circle includes several elderly ladies who've lived in Salvation Springs since its founding. They know every forgotten root cellar and hidden passageway in town." She gestured toward the tunnels behind her. "Most of Hargrove's prisoners are now safely underground. The town is organizing." Abernathy approached the makeshift map, studying Callahan's notations with professional interest. "Hargrove's men are searching buildings systematically. They've already cleared most of Main Street. The hotel and church are being used as observation posts." "And the Silver Serpent mine?" Callahan asked. "Survey teams entered about an hour ago," Catherine replied. "They're mapping the main shaft." Lazarus snorted derisively. "Hargrove's not waiting for legal niceties. He intends to establish mining operations immediately after eliminating opposition." The implications hung in the air. Not just Callahan's life was at stake, but the future of Salvation Springs itself. If Western Mining secured the silver deposits, they would transform the independent community into a company town, subject to corporate control and exploitation. "We need to move quickly," Callahan decided, returning to the map. "Hargrove expects me to attack from outside. Instead, we'll emerge from beneath, targeting key positions simultaneously." His quiet voice took on the cadence of a military briefing, revealing the tactical mind that had made the Shadow so formidable. "Marshal, you'll lead the group taking the jail. Catherine, your people will secure the church tower. Lazarus and I will deal with Hargrove directly." "You trust him at your back?" Abernathy asked incredulously, jerking his head toward Lazarus. "Not remotely," Callahan replied evenly, "but he has as much reason to want Hargrove dead as I do. For now, that's sufficient." As the resistance fighters dispersed to prepare, Callahan found himself momentarily alone with Catherine Reynolds. The storekeeper studied him with new eyes, reconciling the quiet rancher she had known with the tactician now organizing their defense. "All this time," she said softly, "you were hiding in plain sight, the Shadow living as a simple rancher." "Not hiding," Callahan corrected. "Seeking something different, something I lost long ago. Peace, redemption." The word emerged barely audible, as if extracted unwillingly. "After Silver Springs, vengeance consumed me. The Shadow became all that remained. I thought Salvation Springs might offer a way back to the man I was before." Catherine's expression softened with understanding. "Is that man truly gone?" Before Callahan could respond, Jackson Lazarus approached, deliberately interrupting the moment. "If you two are finished with sentimentality, it's nearly dusk, optimal conditions for our counterattack." As shadows lengthened across Salvation Springs, Hargrove's occupation entered its second phase. Having secured the town, the colonel now focused on consolidating control of the surrounding area, particularly the approaches to both Callahan's ranch and the Silver Serpent mine. His men had established an operational headquarters in the sheriff's office, complete with maps, communication protocols, and scheduled patrols. "No sign of Corrigan or Lazarus," reported Morgan, returning from an inspection of the perimeter guards. "Seems strange they haven't attempted to approach." Colonel Hargrove frowned, studying the town map where his forces' positions were marked with military precision. His decades of experience had taught him to distrust apparent advantages. "They're planning something. Corrigan was always adaptable, and Lazarus is unpredictable. Together, they're genuinely dangerous." "You believe they're working together?" Morgan asked skeptically. "From what we know, they were trying to kill each other just yesterday." "The enemy of my enemy," Hargrove replied, tapping the map thoughtfully. "Check the tunnel entrances again, and double the guards at the jail and church." But Hargrove's instincts, though accurate, came too late. Beneath his feet, the resistance had already begun its coordinated assault. The counterattack began with a series of carefully orchestrated diversions. Smoke bombs crafted from mining chemicals erupted at multiple points around town, obscuring visibility and drawing attention outward. Simultaneously, several buildings on the outskirts of Salvation Springs burst into flame. Unoccupied structures, selected specifically to pull Hargrove's forces away from their central positions. As confusion spread through the occupiers' ranks, the true attack emerged from below. Access points concealed beneath buildings, in root cellars, and behind false walls suddenly disgorged determined townspeople armed with whatever weapons they had managed to conceal or improvise. Marshal Abernathy led the assault on the jailhouse, while Catherine's group targeted the church tower where Hargrove had positioned his sharpshooters. The element of surprise proved devastating. Having established defenses oriented outward, Hargrove's men found themselves under attack from within. Their own perimeter, professional discipline gave them an advantage in direct confrontations, but they were outnumbered and fighting on unfamiliar terrain against opponents who knew every corner of their town. In the sheriff's office, Colonel Hargrove recognized the pattern immediately. "Corrigan," he snarled, snatching up his service revolver. "This has all the hallmarks of his Apache campaigns. Multiple coordinated strikes, environmental manipulation, psychological warfare." He turned to Morgan, issuing rapid commands. "Consolidate our forces, abandon outlying positions, establish a defensive core around this building." "And the mine survey team?" Morgan asked, already moving toward the door. "They're on their own. Securing the documents takes priority now." As Hargrove's lieutenant departed to implement these orders, the colonel hurriedly gathered the maps and legal papers relating to the mining claims, stuffing them into a leather portfolio. These represented Western mining's true objective, the legal foundation for claiming not just Callahan's ranch, but potentially the entire mineral-rich valley. Without them, years of planning would collapse. "Going somewhere, Colonel?" The soft-spoken question froze Hargrove mid-motion. He turned slowly to find Matthew Callahan standing in the doorway to the sheriff's private office, a location that should have been impossible for him to reach undetected. The former Army scout held no visible weapon, his hands hanging loosely at his sides in that deceptively casual posture that had preceded so many deaths. "Corrigan?" Hargrove acknowledged, recovering his composure. His revolver remained in his hand, though not yet raised. "Still appearing from nowhere like some ghost story. Some habits never change." "Others do," Callahan replied, stepping further. "Into the room." "I'm not here to kill you, Hargrove." The colonel's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. The legendary shadow has developed mercy? I find that difficult to believe after your blood-soaked journey across 3 territories. Not mercy, justice. Callahan nodded toward the portfolio clutched in Hargrove's hand. Those documents will be evidence in your trial for conspiracy, murder, and fraud. A harsh laugh escaped Hargrove. You're delusional. There will be no trial. Western Mining has judges and legislators on its payroll across the territory. Even if you survive today, which you won't, the company will simply send more men, better equipped, more ruthless. Perhaps, Callahan conceded. But first, they'll need to explain the sworn testimony of one of their own contractors. From the shadows behind Callahan emerged Jackson Lazarus, his aristocratic features set in an expression of cold calculation. Insurance policy, Colonel. I've always maintained detailed records of my business arrangements, including our agreement regarding Silver Springs. Hargrove's face darkened with fury. You treacherous snake. After everything I've done for your Operation Business Necessities, Lazarus interrupted smoothly, throwing Hargrove's earlier words back at him. Nothing personal. The colonel's military discipline reasserted itself quickly. His expression hardened as he assessed this new development with tactical precision. 2 against 1. Still favorable odds considering I'm armed and you appear to be... The revolver appeared in Callahan's hand, as if conjured from air. The movement so swift it seemed to defy natural limitations. Not drawn from a holster, but materialized from beneath. His sleeve, a mechanism Catherine Reynolds had once glimpsed when helping him with packages, dismissed at the time as a rancher's tool. "Drop the gun, Colonel," Callahan instructed quietly. "It's over." For a moment, it seemed Hargrove might comply. His shoulders slumped slightly, the revolver lowering toward the desktop. Then, with the desperation of a man seeing his life's work, unraveling, he snapped the weapon up and fired. The bullet passed through empty air as Callahan shifted with preternatural speed. His return shot struck Hargrove's shoulder, spinning the older man backward against the sheriff's desk. Maps and documents scattered across the floor as the colonel struggled to retain his footing and his aim. What followed unfolded with the dreamlike quality that extreme violence sometimes assumes. Hargrove fired twice more, wild shots that splintered wood and shattered glass. Callahan's response was measured and precise. 2 bullets that found the colonel's gun hand and opposite knee, effectively neutralizing him as a threat without, delivering a fatal wound. As Hargrove collapsed to the floor, his weapon clattering away across the wooden boards, the contrast between the 2 men became starkly apparent. The colonel, for all his military bearing and authority, had fired in panic. Callahan, despite the personal vendetta that had driven him for years, had maintained perfect control. "You should have killed me," Hargrove gasped through pain-gritted teeth. "I still have powerful friends. This isn't over." "It is for you," Callahan replied, collecting the scattered documents that detailed the conspiracy. "Your friends will distance themselves once these become public. Corporations abandon liabilities quickly." Outside, the sounds of conflict were diminishing as Hargrove's outnumbered forces surrendered to the determined townspeople. Marshal Abernathy had secured the jail, freeing Deputy Hayes and establishing a holding area for captured mercenaries. Catherine Reynolds and her improvised militia had retaken the church tower, restoring the town's highest vantage point to local control. Victory had been achieved with remarkable efficiency and minimal bloodshed, a testament to Callahan's planning and the townspeople's courage. Yet as he stood over the defeated Hargrove, the quiet rancher appeared not triumphant but weary, as if the weight of the past had settled more heavily upon his shoulders rather than being lifted. "What now, Shadow?" Lazarus asked, studying his temporary ally with calculating eyes. "Our arrangement is concluded. Do we return to our previous understanding?" Callahan holstered his weapon with the same fluid grace that characterized all his movements. "Take your remaining men and go, Lazarus. Don't return to this territory. Surprise flickered across the outlaw leader's aristocratic features. You're letting me leave, after everything I've done, after Silver Springs. You were a tool, Callahan replied quietly. Hargrove was the architect. Besides, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. Your help today balanced some of that ledger. Not all, enough. The outlaw leader assessed this unexpected reprieve with suspicious consideration. The shadow showing mercy. Now that will damage your fearsome reputation. Perhaps it's time for that reputation to fade. For the shadow to become just a story told around campfires. As the sun set on Salvation Springs, the town began the process of recovery. Hargrove and his men were secured in the jail, awaiting federal transport, while Marshal Abernathy organized the documentation that would ensure justice through legal means rather than vigilante action. The truth about the Silver Serpent mine and the valuable deposits beneath Redemption Valley became public knowledge, with plans already forming for responsible local development that would benefit the community rather than distant corporate interests. 2 days later, as normalcy gradually returned to Salvation Springs, Catherine Reynolds found Matthew Callahan on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sunrise over Redemption Valley. The ruthless efficiency of the shadow had once again receded, replaced by the quiet demeanor of the rancher who had first arrived in town. Yet something fundamental had changed. There was an openness to his posture that hadn't existed before, as if a great weight had been set aside. Marshal Abernathy tells me Hargrove will face trial in Denver, Catherine said, accepting the cup of coffee Callahan offered. Federal prosecutors are particularly interested in the military documents Lazarus preserved. Callahan nodded, his gaze remaining on the distant mountains. Justice delayed, but not denied. And what about you? Will you stay in Salvation Springs now that everyone knows your history? The question hung in the morning air, laden with implications. The town had accepted Callahan as their defender during the crisis, but living alongside a legend carried its own complications. The Shadow's reputation would attract other challenges, other danger. Matthew Corrigan died at Silver Springs, Callahan replied after a thoughtful pause. The Shadow served his purpose across 3 territories. Perhaps Matthew Callahan can find something different here, something worth building rather than avenging. Catherine's smile held understanding and something more, a recognition of the man beneath both identities, neither the broken victim nor the vengeful specter, but something more complex and human than either. I think he already has, she said softly. As word spread of the events at Salvation Springs, the legend of the Shadow evolved once more. No longer just a vengeful spirit dispensing frontier justice, but a more nuanced figure who had chosen mercy when vengeance lay within his grasp. Some said he had disappeared, vanishing as mysteriously as he had first emerged after Silver Springs. Others insisted he had simply set aside his guns for a rancher's tools, finding peace in the same territory that had witnessed his most famous exploits. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between these extremes. Matthew Callahan continued his quiet existence in Redemption Valley, gradually becoming an accepted, if somewhat enigmatic presence in the community. If his eyes still scanned horizons with a predator's vigilance, if his hands still moved with unnatural speed when startled, these were accepted as remnants of a past that had shaped but no longer defined him. And sometimes, when trouble threatened the borders of Salvation Springs, when outlaws considered the seemingly vulnerable town as a potential target, they would encounter warnings from those who had witnessed the Shadow's work. Descriptions of a soft-spoken man whose whispers carried more menace than another's shouts, tales of impossible speed and unerring accuracy, stories of a guardian who moved between darkness and light, dispensing justice with the cold precision. of fate itself. Most heeded these warnings, seeking easier prey elsewhere. Those few who dismissed them as frontier mythology rarely lived to acknowledge their mistake. For though Matthew Callahan might have found a measure of peace, the shadow remained, not as an active hunter, but as a promise of consequences for those who brought violence to his adopted home. In this way, the legend served its final purpose, not as a chronicle of vengeance, but as a shield protecting what its creator had come to value. The soft-spoken rancher and the deadly gunslinger had finally found balance, each aspect of the same complex man contributing to a life that honored both justice and mercy. And in the annals of frontier history, the Shadow's reckoning would be remembered not for its body count or the fear it inspired, but for the redemption it ultimately represented. Proof that even the darkest legend could find its way back to the light. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.